Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry by Owen Barfield, 2nd edition. 6. Original Participation. It is characteristic of our phenomena, indeed it is this above all which distinguishes them from those of the past, that our participation in them and therefore also their representational nature is excluded from our immediate awareness. It is consequently always ignored by our common sense, and sometimes denied even in theory. For this reason, it will be best to begin the brief series of observations that is the history of the familiar world, from the present day and to work backwards from there to the remoter past. Our first step, then, is to trace the last stage of this development, which has led up to the collective representations with which we are familiar today. Participation is the extrasensory relation between man and the phenomena. It was shown in Chapter 3 that the existence of phenomena depends on it. Actual participation is, therefore, as much a fact in our case as in that of primitive man. But we have also seen that we are unaware, whereas the primitive mind is aware of it. This primitive awareness, however, is obviously not the theoretical kind which we can still arrive at by beta thinking. For that presupposes some acquaintance with the findings of modern physics and physiology, and can only be applied to the kind of collective representations that go with this. The primitive kind of participation is indeed not theoretical at all, inasmuch as it is given in immediate experience. Let us distinguish it from ours by calling it original participation. It would, however, be cumbersome to add the epithet every time the word is used, and I propose very often to omit it, having first made it plain here and now that by participation I shall mean original participation, unless the context otherwise requires. There is another difference between sophisticated and primitive participation. Hitherto we have spoken of representations and of the unrepresented, but we have said nothing of any represented. This raises the question whether representation was the proper word to use at all, or whether it is merely misleading. If an appearance can properly be called a representation, it will certainly be a representation of something. Just as the particles, then, the name here chosen for all that is conceived to exist independently of consciousness, have also been called the unrepresented, so whatever is correlative to the appearances or representations will here be called the represented. This is, of course, a mere name, and gives as yet no clue to the nature of what is meant. I hope that further light will be thrown upon it gradually as we proceed. Meanwhile, I must use the name, leaving the reader to make up his mind, ambulando, whether it was justified or not. We have seen that a very large part of the collective representations is found by beta thinking to have been contributed by the percipient's own activity. Beta thinking, therefore, inevitably assumes that a very large part of their correlative, the represented, is to be found within ourselves. Consequently, if our participation, having been first understood and accepted by beta thinking as a fact, should then become a conscious experience, it would have to take the form of conscious, instead of, as now unconscious, figuration. This is because for us, the represented is conceived as within our percipient selves, and it is only an unrepresented physical base, particles, which we conceive of as without. Not so for primitives. For them, the represented too is conceived as outside, so that there is no question of conscious figuration. It may also sometimes be detected within, but it is detected primarily without. The human soul may be one of the stopping places for mana, but what differentiates the primitive mind from ours is that it conceives itself to be only one of those stopping places, and not necessarily the most significant. The essence of original participation is that there stands behind the phenomena, and on the other side of them from me, a represented which is of the same nature as me. Whether it is called manna, or by the names of many gods and demons, or God the Father, or the spirit world, it is of the same nature as the perceiving self, inasmuch as it is not mechanical or accidental, but psychic and voluntary. I have here assumed that what Levi-Bruhl and Durkheim and their followers say about contemporary primitive man is substantially correct, and it seems to me likely to be so. But whether or not it is correct for contemporary primitive man, it is certainly true of historically early man. All the evidence from etymology and elsewhere goes to show that the further back we penetrate into the past of human consciousness, the more mythical in their nature do the representations become. Moreover, there is no evidence to the contrary. I shall say something later on of the testimony borne by etymology. Here it must suffice to affirm categorically that, for the 19th century fantasy of early man first gazing with his mind tabula rasa at natural phenomena like ours, then seeking to explain them with thoughts like ours, and then by a process of inference peopling them with the airy phantoms of mythology, there just is not any single shred of evidence whatever. I do not mean by using the word fantasy to imply contempt. If great scholars like Max Muller and Sir James Frazer, in seeking for the historical origins of myth, made the same mistake as the early anthropologists, it will, I hope, become apparent in the course of this and the ensuing chapters how inevitable it was that they should do so. Today, on the other hand, partly thanks to their work, any little man, provided he is not hopelessly prejudiced, can convince himself of the contrary. The point is not to find someone to turn up our noses at, but to grasp the fact that alpha thinking, when men first began to exercise it, had to be directed upon that kind of collective representation, namely the participated kind, and not on the collective representations resembling ours, which, as we shall see, are a later product of that very alpha thinking. For alpha thinking, as I have defined it, is a thinking about collective representations. But when we think about anything, we must necessarily be aware of ourselves, that is, of the self which is doing the thinking, as sharply and clearly detached from the thing thought about. It follows that alpha thinking involves pro tanto absence of participation. It is, in fact, the very nature and aim of pure alpha thinking to exclude participation. When, therefore, it is directed, as it has to be to start with, on phenomena determined by original participation, then, at first simply by being alpha thinking, and at a later stage deliberately, it seeks to destroy that participation. The more so because, as we shall also see, participation renders the phenomena less predictable and less calculable. The history of alpha thinking accordingly includes the history of science, as the term has hitherto been understood, and reaches its culmination in a system of thought which only interests itself in phenomena to the extent that they can be grasped as independent of consciousness. This culmination appears to have been reached about the close of the 19th century, for along with the recent tendency of physics to implicate the observer again in the phenomena, there goes the tendency of physicists to give up alpha thinking about phenomena and occupy themselves as mathematicians only with the unrepresented. Systematic alpha thinking appears to have begun with astronomy. Whether this was because the movements of the heavenly bodies display a regularity which is mostly lacking in sublunary phenomena, and which would be the first, therefore, to attract the attention of minds beginning for the first time to interest themselves in regularity, or whether it was for some other reason, we need not consider. Astronomy is generally regarded as the doyen of the sciences, and at a glance, at its history from Greek times to the present day or thereabouts will afford some insight into the development of that exact thinking about phenomena which is called science, and the effect of that development on the collective representations of Western man. I say from Greek times because, although the Egyptians and Chaldeans appear to have kept astronomical records over a very long period, we know nothing of any avowedly speculative thought earlier than the Greeks, either on this or any other subject. That the collective representations to which this speculative thought was applied were of the kind already indicated, i.e., participated, is obvious enough. Apart from speculative thought, it would never have occurred to an ancient Greek to doubt that the heavenly bodies and their spheres were in one way or another representations of divine beings. Such a doubt was, in fact, voiced occasionally, simply because the Greek mind was of such an incorrigibly speculative nature that there was very little that did not occur to it, as a purely notional possibility. But the point is that, in the early days of alpha thinking, any such notion was a secondary speculation, and rather a wild one, about the collective representations whose character made the contrary representational view seem the obvious one. The systematic alpha thinking exercised only by the thoughtful few is applied to the phenomena, that is, to collective representations which they share with the many. And we are left in no doubt by Plato's dialogues and by the whole language and literature of Greece what these in general were like. There it was the materialist who looked like a Berkeley, and the Greek equivalent of Dr. Johnson would return from speculation to common sense not by kicking a stone, but by appealing to collective representations made obvious by his upbringing, by the language he spoke and heard spoken all around him, and by the active cults which were his daily matter-of-fact experience. Even the atoms of Democritus were, of course, not atoms as the word has been understood in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were imagined as components of mind no less than of matter. In other words, they were the only sort of atoms which alpha thinking about participated phenomena could present to itself for the purpose of speculation. It is in this light that we must approach, if we wish to understand them, not only the speculations of Plato and Aristotle, for instance, on the nature of the stars and planets, but also the meanings of common words like nous and logos, and the whole apparatus of language by which they expressed these speculations. If we are content to translate and to think mind for nous and reason or word for logos, we are in continual danger of surreptitiously substituting our own phenomena for those which they were in fact dealing with. It is not only that they speculated on whether the planets were visible gods, or only images of the gods, as statues are, on the nature of the fifth essence and its relation to the earthly elements, on the anima mundi, on whether or not the ether, which is the substance of the spheres, has a soul, etc. The very meanings of the incidental words with the help of which they did the speculating implied participation of some sort, whereas the words into which we struggle to translate them imply the reverse. Some examples of these words will be considered in a later chapter, when it will be seen that original participation survived in an attenuated form even into the Middle Ages. It may remove the risk of misunderstanding if I mention at this early stage that it is no part of the object of this book to advocate a return to original participation. (7) Appearance and hypothesis. According to Plato, there were 3 stages or degrees of knowledge. The first and lowest amounted to no more than observation. Since all that we perceive is continually changing, coming into being, and passing away, this kind of knowledge grasps nothing permanent, and nothing therefore which can properly be called truth. At the opposite pole, the highest degree, which is the only one that can properly be called knowledge, is wholly extrasensory. it is the contemplation by pure intelligence of the divine ideas, and above all, of the supreme good. The union of these two, that is, of pure intelligence and sense knowledge, gives rise to an intermediate mental activity which Plato stigmatized as bastard, although he insisted on all his pupils studying it as a preparation and a means to the true knowledge. This intermediate activity was geometry, or, as we should now say, mathematics. These 3 degrees of knowledge correspond with 3 different levels of astronomy. The astronomy of observation merely records the movements of the stars, the sun, the moon, and the planets, without attempting to account for them or reduce them to any system. From this we can rise to the second astronomy, which seeks to account for the apparently arbitrary movements of, for instance, the planets, by supposing regular geometrical patterns to underlie them. By the exercise of this celestial geometry, we can render ourselves capable of rising eventually to the third and highest, that is, to the only true knowledge, which is an unobscured participation in the divine mind, or word itself. The real wisdom, as distinct from its not wholly unworthy outcome in the permanent truths of geometry, manifests itself only to him who participates in, however slight a degree, in the pure and divine intelligence. This intelligent participation, the privilege of philosophy and in the last resort of initiation, was not mystical. For mystical experience is essentially other than ordinary experience. But the Platonic or Aristotelian participation, which was true knowledge, was simply the half-conscious participation of every man, the participation by virtue of which he was a man, cleared of the gross and bewildering mutability which is plastered over it by the other approach, through the senses. Plato further laid it down orally, as we learn from later astronomers, that the science of astronomy properly lay within the middle one of these 3 spheres of knowledge. In the first place, the phenomena, or appearances, that is, the apparent movements of the heavenly bodies, could be watched by observation. In the third place, the true knowledge, since it was acquainted with the divine spirits who ensouled or guided the heavenly bodies, had already laid down certain fundamental principles, not derived from observation. It was for the science of astronomy, in the second place, to save the appearances, that is, the apparent movements of the heavenly bodies, and particularly of sun, moon, and planets, which were the most difficult to account for, by devising hypothetical patterns of movement which would account for the appearances without infringing the fundamental principles. Later on, I shall say something of the mental spatial experience, which claimed to determine the nature of movement out of the nature of pure thought. It appears as a mere confusion to the alpha thinking of today, though that too is beginning to talk without appreciable discomfort of space-time. Here it must suffice to record that the prescribed movements were, among other requirements, perfect circles at a constant speed. There is, perhaps, more of physics than of astronomy in Aristotle's Decalo, but, as far as the 3 stages of knowledge and the fundamental principles just referred to are concerned, he was substantially in accord with Plato. The phenomena of which the astronomy of Greece and of the Dark and Middle Ages spoke were, of course, not quite what we today mean by phenomena, a word which, outside philosophy, has come to be practically synonymous with objects and events. The middle voice of the Greek verb suggests neither wholly what is perceived from within themselves by men, nor wholly what from without forces itself on man's senses, but something between the two. This is also fairly suggested by the English word appearances, which is generally used in translating the once hard-worked phrase, to save the appearances. This phrase, used by Simplicius in his 6th century commentary on Aristotle's Decalo, continued to dominate astronomy down to the time of Copernicus. When we hear of saving appearances today, we are apt to think of a society hostess at a dinner party where something has gone wrong in the kitchen. It was not so in the 17th century. Although he spoke of God's laughter, Milton was not himself laughing at the astronomers when he wrote in the 8th book of Paradise Lost, "Or if they list to try, conjecture he is fabric of the heavens, hath left to their disputes, perhaps to move his laughter at their quaint opinions wide. Hereafter, when they come to model heaven, and calculate the stars, how they will wield the mighty frame, how build, unbuild, contrive, to save appearances, how gird the sphere, with centric and eccentric scribbled o'er, cycle and epicycle, orb in orb." Nor was he suggesting that desperate expedients were being resorted to in order to save, in the sense of rescuing, the Ptolemaic system, which incidentally he had made the framework of his own poem. He was introducing a learned cliché. The same passage from Simplicius contains the Greek verb from which we derive the word hypothesis. The spheres and orbits by which the appearances were to be saved were normally hypotheses in the strict sense of the word, that is, assumptions made for the purpose of a particular argument, and by the same token not posited as true. A brief digression on the almost lost distinction between the word hypothesis and the word theory may not be amiss here. The Greek word theoria meant contemplation, and is the term used in Aristotle's psychology to designate the moment of fully conscious participation in which the soul's potential knowledge, its ordinary state, becomes actual, so that man can at last claim to be awake. This is no guide to its present or even recent meaning, but it does emphasize the difference between a proposition which it is hoped may turn out to be true, and a proposition the truth or untruth of which is irrelevant. The geometrical paths and movements devised for the planets were, in the minds of those who invented them, hypotheses in the latter sense. They were arrangements, devices for saving the appearances, and the Greek and medieval astronomers were not at all disturbed by the fact that the same appearances could be saved by two or more quite different hypotheses, such as an eccentric or epicycle, or, particularly in the case of Venus and Mercury, by supposed revolution round the Earth or supposed revolution round the Sun. All that mattered was which was the simplest and most convenient for practical purposes, for neither of them had any essential part in truth or knowledge. Unless we realize, with the help of a little historical excavation of this kind, what from the epistemological point of view astronomy then signified and had signified for about 2,000 years, we shall not understand the real significance of Copernicus and Galileo. The popular view is that Copernicus discovered that the Earth moves round the Sun. Actually, the hypothesis that the Earth revolves round the Sun is at least as old as the 3rd century BC, when it was advanced by Aristarchus of Samos, and he was neither the only nor probably the first astronomer to think of it. Copernicus himself knew this. Secondly, it is generally believed that the Church tried to keep the discovery dark. Actually, Copernicus did not himself want to publish his De Revolutionibus Orbium, and was only eventually prevailed on to do so by the importunity of two eminent churchmen. The real turning point in the history of astronomy and of science in general was something else altogether. It took place when Copernicus, probably it cannot be regarded as certain, began to think, and others, like Kepler and Galileo, began to affirm, that the heliocentric hypothesis not only saved the appearances, but was physically true. It was this novel idea, that the Copernican, and therefore any other, hypothesis might not be a hypothesis at all, but the ultimate truth, that was almost enough in itself to constitute the scientific revolution of which Professor Barfield has written, It outshines everything since the rise of Christianity and reduces the Renaissance and Reformation to the rank of mere episodes, mere internal displacements within the system of medieval Christendom. When the ordinary man hears that the Church told Galileo that he might teach Copernicanism as a hypothesis which saved all the celestial phenomena satisfactorily, but not as being the truth, he laughs. But this was really how Ptolemaic astronomy had been taught. In its actual place in history, it was not a caustical quibble. It was the refusal, unjustified it may be, to allow the introduction of a new and momentous doctrine. It was not simply a new theory of the nature of celestial movement that was feared, but a new theory of the nature of theory, namely that, if a hypothesis saves all the appearances, it is identical with truth. Geometry, applied to motion, produces the machine. Years ago, the Arabs had used the Ptolemaic hypothesis to make machines or models of the planetary system purely for the purpose of calculation. Our collective representations were born when men began to take the models, whether geometrical or mechanical, literally. The machine is geometry in motion, and the new picture of the heavens as a real machine was made possible by parallel developments in physics, where the new theory of inertia, in its early form of impetus, assumed for the first time in the history of the world that bodies can go on moving indefinitely without an animate or physic mover. It was soon to be stamped indelibly on men's imaginations by the circumstance of their being ever more and more surrounded by actual artificial machinery on earth. The whole point of a machine is that, for as long as it goes on moving, it goes on by itself, without man's participation. To the extent, therefore, that the phenomena are experienced as machine, they are believed to exist independently of man, not to be participated, and therefore not to be in the nature of representations. We have seen that all these beliefs are fallacious. All this is not, of course, to say that science today conceives of nature as a machine or even on a mechanical model. It is to say that the ordinary man has been doing just that for long enough to deprive the phenomena of those last representational overtones, last enchantments, as Matthew Arnold called them, which still informed them in the Middle Ages, and to eliminate from them the last traces of original participation. In doing so, he has produced the mechanomorphic collective representations which constitute the Western world today.